Coming up on Bridge City News, Joe Biden is declared the winner of the U.S. election after a record voter turnout. Premier Jason Kenney urges an end to house parties in the fight against COVID-19. And we tell you how one 19-year-old autistic man lost over 75 pounds walking to his mailbox.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News Weekend Edition.
Thank you for joining us. Democratic candidate Joe Biden has won the U.S. presidential election after he secured enough electoral college votes on Saturday, according to U.S. networks. Biden defeated his Republican rival, U.S. President Donald Trump, to become the 46th president of the United States. Kelly Daschle from Associated Press has the story.
And I'm grateful to all of my supporters here in Delaware and all across the nation. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Trump used the vote processing delays to falsely allege voter fraud and argue that Biden was trying to steal the election.
They're trying to rig an election, and we can't let that happen.
An extraordinary charge by a sitting American president trying to sow doubt about a bedrock democratic process. As the vote count played out, Biden looked to ease tensions, urging the nation to come together after a bitter and divisive campaign.
To make progress, we have to stop treating our opponents as enemies. What brings us together as Americans is so much stronger than anything that can tear us apart.
The election also gave Kamala Harris a place in history as the first Black woman and South Asian American to become vice president. The California senator will become the highest-ranking woman to ever serve in U.S. government, 4 years after Trump defeated Hillary Clinton. While it remains unclear whether he will publicly concede, Trump is now the first incumbent president to lose re-election since George H.W. Bush in 1992.
Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has asked people to stop hosting house parties or get-togethers. He also extended a 15-person public gathering limit in Edmonton and Calgary to include other communities, including here in Lethbridge. Alberta reported 1,400 COVID-19 cases in the last 2 days.
Every Albertan needs to be concerned about these numbers. We've seen how hospitals get overrun in other jurisdictions around the world. We must not let that happen here in Alberta. This is a turning point. If we don't bend the curve down now, we'll face even tougher choices in the days ahead. But if we take smart, targeted actions and each do our part, we can continue to protect people's lives and livelihoods. Alberta's government will always follow the evidence and the data based on the advice of our public health experts. The truth is that COVID-19 is being spread in part by at parties, through get-togethers and other gatherings with friends, neighbors, and extended family.
Nunavut's chief public health officer has confirmed the territory's first case of COVID-19. Michael Patterson says the individual and family are in isolation and contact tracing is underway in the community.
We received confirmatory results of a positive case of COVID-19 in Sanikiluaq. All travel to and from the Belcher Islands, including the hamlet of Sanikiluaq, by any means is restricted. There are exceptions for emergency medical travel, critical entry for medical response, flight emergencies, and cargo. Hunters may also leave the community but may not travel to any other community or populated area outside the Belcher Islands. It is also advised that hunters leaving the community closely monitor themselves for symptoms and return home if any develop.
A Coaldale woman says her 19-year-old autistic son has lost over 75 pounds walking to their P.O. box looking for mail. She says receiving mail helps to keep him motivated on his daily walks and brings excitement and happiness to his day.
As Carson's mom, I'm so proud of him. I'm proud of his weight loss. I'm proud of everything that he's achieved so far in his life. Carson doesn't have the ability to use language to express his needs. but he certainly has found a way through the years to let us know what he likes, what he doesn't like, what brings him joy. My goal is for people to know Carson, to see him in public, to wave to him, say hi. I've had actually a few people drop things off to my house since I put the post on, and a couple people just said, well, I bought him this little gift, but it was a little pricey to mail, so could I just drop the gift off and then send him some cards in the future? Yes, that's wonderful. Not that that's what we expect at all, but just the generosity it's amazing. It's just, it warms my heart, and it's just wonderful.
If you would like to send Carson some mail to brighten his day, you can do so at P.O. Box 871, Coaldale, Alberta, T1M1M7. Families struggling this Christmas will be able to count on some help from a toy tower. Tony Roma's restaurant in Lethbridge will be open for toy donations in order to help build the tower, which provides for needy kids this holiday season.
Our staff have come together this year. We know everybody's been facing some hard times, some different times. So we decided that maybe we could help give back to some local families, and we're gonna start collecting toys for them. It's from newborn all the way up to 18 years old. We're looking for new unwrapped toys. Anything is appreciated. They're all going to the Salvation Army. We're just all super thankful that we have a job right now, and we have some place where we can go, and we have an income to support our families. And I do know that there's some families out there that are struggling, and we're just so thankful that we all are employed. So we thought we would help give back in any way that we can. So when people bring us something, we're gonna also give them a gift too.
Shauna Pinay's world turned upside down when she was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. But she says God helped her through her trials, and now she is cancer-free. The Lethbridge woman shared her story with Bridge City News.
I was feeling like a mass in one of my breasts, and I never really thought anything of it because a year before that I had gone in and they had said it was a cyst.
Her doctor did a biopsy, and that's when her results came back as stage 3 cancer.
I was in absolute shock because when somebody tells, anybody even says the C word, cancer, right? And a lot of my relatives have passed away from different kinds of cancers. So of course I was, worried and scared and depressed and sad because you just don't know, right? You don't know what the outcome is going to be.
Pinay says she had to use her faith to fight the diagnosis.
Anybody who's been through chemo, it's not a pretty thing. You get really, really physically sick. It's like having a flu times 10 or 15. It's really, really hard on your body. You lose your hair, you lose everything, and you don't have much energy. And, I somehow was able to, and I know it's my faith that kept me, and I was able to work every day through that. And I just knew that I just needed to keep fighting.
As of 2 years ago, Pinay is now cancer-free, and she believes it's a miracle.
God's not finished with me yet. I still have things to do in my life. And he just, brought me through this on my journey. And the journey was hard, and it was sad, and it was hurtful. And I just know that I'm a miracle for a reason. Whether it's to talk to other people and bring light to them and give hope to them that, it's not all darkness. It's not all, that we all can't make it and stuff like that. There is hope through breast cancer, and that you can survive through it.
Recapping one of our top news stories, Democratic candidate Joe Biden has won the U.S. presidential election after he secured enough electoral college votes, according to U.S. networks. Biden defeated his Republican rival, U.S. President Donald Trump, to become the 46th president of the United States. And a look at weekend weather. Tonight we have blowing snow about 10 to 15 centimeters overnight and a low of -8. Tomorrow expect more snow with blizzard conditions in the morning, 10 to 20 centimeters of snow and a high of only -8 degrees. After the break, catch our interview with Cody Battershill, the founder of Canada Action, on the struggles of our country's energy sector.
The biggest benefactors of the opposition to Keystone were Venezuela, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and Ecuador, countries that obviously do not support Canadian jobs, and also countries that often have inferior environmental, social, and governance standards.
Canada's energy sector continues to struggle during the COVID-19 pandemic. Where are we headed when it comes to our country's oil and gas industries? Joining me now from Calgary is Cody Battershill, founder of Canada Action. It's a volunteer-led grassroots movement encouraging Canadians to take action in support of natural resources sector. Cody, welcome back to Bridge City News.
Thank you so much for having me again. I really appreciate the opportunity to be back with you.
Oh, absolutely, Cody. Now, with current government oil and gas policies limiting investment and exports, do we have numbers really right now as to how much this is impacting the overall Canadian economy?
What we know is that over the last several years, we have imported millions of dollars per day of oil from other countries. We know that we have lost out on billions of dollars of potential government revenues. We know that we have lost out on investment and job creation to the tunes of hundreds of billions of dollars. And this is a part of the anti-pipeline campaign that has uniquely targeted Canada. And now during this COVID crisis, we see that we need a strong, competitive energy industry more than ever to get our economy back on track and to support Canadian jobs for Canadian families.
Why do you think it is that Ottawa's so anti-pipeline, especially when it comes to supporting Alberta's energy sector? They'd rather bring in oil from Saudi Arabia?
Well, it's interesting because you have the Trans Mountain Pipeline that is moving forward, and that's very, very important. But when it comes to Energy East and when it comes to Northern Gateway, these are other projects that did need to get built for Canada to achieve full value for our resources, which benefits all Canadians. Additionally, with Energy East, we were going to be able to upgrade and refine more of our oil, get more Western Canadian oil to Eastern Canadian consumers, and that would have displaced other foreign oil imports coming into the country, also allowing for us to export potentially into Europe and other countries around the world. We know that there's strong demand for our oil, our natural gas, and our resources around the world. Countries want to do business with Canada, and we need to make sure that we have a competitive environment. I like to say that we should have an all-inclusive energy platform rather than a non-inclusive, because it's great to support wind and solar, but we also need to be supporting oil and gas.
So let's talk about some of those pipelines. You mentioned Trans Mountain as well, Energy East, which is dead on the table, I guess. Which ones are up and running and which ones are still facing regulatory hurdles?
Well, the important one right now that we see under construction is Trans Mountain. And Trans Mountain, they're under construction in Kamloops. That pipeline, there's a lot of misinformation that's put out by the anti-pipeline groups. So the original project has been operating since 1953. Marine shipments since 1956. There has never been a marine incident or a catastrophe. They are expanding the project now, which will get more Canadian oil into Burnaby, where we can then export that down into California or over into Asia. We are sending oil to Asia now, and it's so important that we diversify our customers as much as possible away from the United States so that we can get the best global price for our oil. Currently, just in the last couple of weeks, we have seen refiners in Spain and in India looking to buy Canadian oil. Now, the frustrating part, though, is that they're looking to buy it through the U.S. because we have not built enough of our own pipelines. So there's a good example of this missed opportunity. And going forward, as a country, we need to be talking about how we're going to solve that. The other project that is already built in Canada, but it's still awaiting some final permitting in the U.S. is the Line 3 project. That's actually just a replacement project for an existing pipeline to upgrade it to brand new modern technology. That's very important. As well, we still have Keystone XL, the saga of Keystone, under construction in some parts of Canada and the US, including the border crossing. Very important for North American energy security. And we've seen over the last 10 years, as long as Keystone has been opposed, global oil demand increased by about 10 million barrels per day until pre-COVID. And the biggest benefactors of the opposition to Keystone were Venezuela, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and Ecuador, countries that obviously do not support Canadian jobs, and also countries that often have inferior environmental, social, and governance standards. So a very important part of the conversation really is who benefits when Canadian pipelines are blocked.
Cody, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has decided to lift the cap on crude oil production as of December. What does this really mean for the energy sector?
Well, it means that there's some increased confidence now in pipeline capacity and in storage in Alberta, because the curtailment was brought in to help manage the differential. If we can get Trans Mountain built, if we can get Line 3 finished, if we possibly get Keystone, plus there's some other pipeline maintenance and debottlenecking projects, if we can get increased pipeline capacity, we won't have to necessarily worry about the massive discounts again, the way that they were. I mean, at one point we were losing, $100 million a day. Selling the world's most regulated oil as a top producer with the most heavily discounted price, and there's a huge disconnect between those two statements. So this lifting of the curtailments is positive overall. We obviously want to see Alberta as as a jurisdiction for investment, for job creation, and for continued growth in our oil and natural gas industry. And this is one step in that sequence.
So how would you respond to the objections from environmentalists on the decision to lift the cap?
Well, there's just so many decisions and so many things that are being said by some of these groups. And let's be clear, all Canadians support the environment, but Canadians do not support giving opportunity and jobs that could be benefiting our families and our communities to other countries with weaker environmental standards. The groups, a lot of these groups, they say they care about the climate, they say they care about the environment, but their actions do not match up with the words. Because if those two statements were in fact what they valued, they would be supporting Canadian energy getting to the world, Canadian energy production increasing, and they would also be having a balanced, constructive conversation about how we can continue working together to improve our environmental footprint. But they would recognize we are already leading on so many regards and so many metrics. And as Canadians, we really, truly should be proud of our people, our resources, and our record.
Any thoughts on the recent merger between Cenovus and Husky, the $3.8 billion stock deal? Now, we're talking about some serious job losses, around 2,000 positions, Cody.
Yeah, and it's so sad, and I just feel for everyone. I mean, we've been watching now for many years, and we need to get back to a position where Canada can compete internationally. We need to get back to a position where companies want to invest in Canada rather than leaving Canada. In this situation, I'm glad that the headquarters is staying in Canada. It's not like Cenovus could have invested in the US or they could have invested overseas, but they did buy another Canadian or merge with another Canadian company. There are some positives, but that doesn't diminish the serious impact to families. And we need a strong energy sector so that we can grow jobs and grow opportunity for our communities again in the future. And hopefully a strong Cenovus will be able to do that in the years to come.
Now, there's some good news for Calgary. Suncor announced that they're moving their Ontario petrochem head office to the Stampede City. That should affect around 700 workers. And the company says it will ensure that they remain competitive for the long term. How so?
Well, we want our companies competitive, and so I think moving that staff into Calgary, we have a lot of great office space. We have a great quality of life, a great place to live. We're going through some economic challenges, and so bringing these positions here, it might mean potentially some local hiring if people can't move. And anytime we hear jobs coming to Calgary, that's a good thing. And we hope to get back into that trend going forward for the future, because again, we have the people, we have the knowledge, the innovation, the ingenuity, the expertise, the experience, and we should be a choice jurisdiction for investment for any energy company anywhere in the world that cares about the environment. They should be doing business in Alberta and in Canada.
Alberta definitely has the infrastructure to support our energy industry. Cody, solar and wind energy only accounted for about 4% of total U.S. consumption in 2019. The green energy lobby says fossil fuels need to be scrapped as soon as possible. But at this rate, is that anywhere near realistic?
It's not realistic. And this is not a conversation where we should be asked to choose between oil or solar, natural gas or wind. The reality is we need all of the above. And that's why we have to have this all-inclusive conversation. You cannot build a solar panel or a wind turbine without massive volumes of mined materials, oil and natural gas, and other advanced resources that have come from the earth. And at the end of the day, we still know that right now we do not have the backup battery technology to store wind or solar energy when the sun's not shining and the wind is not blowing. So the reality is, when you look around the world right now at where some of these intermittent renewables are, they're not there yet. And it is not fair, it is not honest to be telling people that we need to make this choice today because they themselves cannot make that choice. Oil, it's been said that even in 2040, when all cars might be sold as electric vehicles, oil demand will still be around 2012 or 2013 levels because of plastics, petrochemicals, and other uses. So the fact is, oil and gas are going to be critical parts of the global energy mix for decades to come. And if we don't invest in our own production, other countries will take that market share and the environment will be worse off. And if we don't invest, period, then we will have massive crippling shortages of energy, and we will all experience what it was like to live 75 or 150 or 200 years ago without modern energy supply and the products that we all depend on that are derived from oil and natural gas.
So with the continuing push for green energy, though, Cody, many are saying that global demand for oil is dropping off the charts. But you know what? You and I have both seen what's happening in the United States, China, India. Nothing could be further from the truth.
China's got record oil imports right now, year over year. You also have to address depletion. Every year, the world loses some of the existing oil supply that runs out. If we don't invest in recreating that supply, even when demand is flat, we are going to have an acute energy shortage. So oil demand, when Keystone XL was originally proposed, was around 90 million barrels per day. And in February of this year, pre-COVID, oil demand was right around 100 million barrels per day. It dropped down to, say, 90 million. It's back up to 95, 96 right now. And back into 2022 or 2023, all of the major forecasting agencies expect oil demand will be back above 100 million barrels per day, and it will grow for at least another decade or two, and you have to replace depletion. So where should that supply come from? And for anyone who cares about the environment, human rights, worker safety, and for any Canadian that cares about Canadian opportunity, jobs, and prosperity, I firmly believe that the world needs more Canadian energy for those reasons.
Cody, let's talk about coal for just a moment. Are you able to comment on the Grassy Mountain Coal Project in the Crow's Nest Pass? Is it possible to protect wildlife and the environment while at the same time creating hundreds of new jobs in the region?
It's absolutely possible. That's the Canadian way. And if this project goes through a rigorous, thorough environmental regulatory process, and if it's found to be in the public economic interest in a way that can balance environmental protection, then it absolutely has merit. The reality is right now, global coal use is actually still growing, and we have thousands of new coal-fired power plants around the world. Plus, you also have metallurgical coal for making steel and other products that we all use every day without even realizing how they come to be. And so if we can produce Canadian resources to our high environmental standards and get that to the world, we create jobs for Canadians, we protect the local environment while also protecting the global environment with our leading standards. And so if the project can go through that process and is found to be balanced between the two, then absolutely it could proceed.
What is the overall outlook in 2021 for our energy sector? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm optimistic because there's been such a decline around the world in oil and gas drilling, specifically oil drilling. Norway has cut back substantially. The US has cut back substantially. And so if we can get through COVID, and if demand starts to come back to where it was, in the next 1 to 2 years, I think right now it looks like, and many market commentators would say that it looks like we could have a little bit of a supply shortfall. And it's a good opportunity for Canada because we have well-regulated, environmentally progressive, long life opportunities in the oil sands and in our conventional oil and gas industry with leading environmental metrics to help meet that demand. And we want to see rigs working. We want to see people employed. We want to see families successful, and also the economic opportunity. One stat that is absolutely mind-blowing: from 2000 until 2018, the women and men who work in our oil and gas industry in the oil and gas sector generated $380 billion for Canadian governments. That is an example of the foundational opportunity, the fundamental opportunity that our resource sector has been and can continue to be for our country.
You would think maybe the Trudeau Liberals would realize, hey, we're sitting on a gold mine here in Alberta. Why not tap into it, help develop those resources, and pay off some of our debt and get the deficit under control?
We need our resources firing on all cylinders. We need to support all jobs in all sectors. So support tourism, support in an all-inclusive manner. The fact is, oil and gas is one of the most tech-forward industries in the country. Resources account for such a huge part as well of our manufacturing base. The oil and gas industry does business with thousands of companies across Canada and is our largest export and has been the largest reason for our trade surplus over the last several years. So we are a resource nation. We are a nation of amazing people, amazing animals, amazing places like our national parks and our natural resources that we have developed using Canadian innovation, Canadian ingenuity. And we need to be champions of this opportunity we have. Other countries call it a blessing and a gift. And it's so important that we all speak up in support of a balanced, constructive conversation about why the world needs more Canadian resources.
Amen to that. Cody Battershill, founder of Canada Action, thanks for joining me today from Calgary.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Racism is one of the big issues that comes up during elections, and it's getting a lot of discussion lately. Does Canada have a systemic racism problem, though? Is the church racist? Today's guest is Ricardo Fortune, the Quebec coordinator for Faith Beyond Belief, an apologetics organization based out of Calgary. He joins me now via Skype from Montreal. Welcome to the show, Ricardo. It's nice to have you on.
Thanks for having me, Jeanette.
Ricardo, in Canada, we often hear academics, politicians, and media pundits saying that we have a systemic racism problem in this country. I think we need to, first of all, have a working definition of what racism is and also what we mean by systemic.
I totally agree with you there, Janet. Before engaging in any type of conversation, it's always a good practice to define our terms. So let's start with the word racism. Racism is the ideology that values one race over the other. So that would be a broad definition of it. But what does that mean concretely? How does it manifest itself in our societies? But we can focus on three forms that racism takes. Usually, you can recognize it in the form of racial dogmas, teachings, such as that would affirm racial superiority, white supremacy, these type of things, or all types of idea of maintaining racial purity. Another one would be racial biases. It manifests itself when people have preconceived judgment or unjustified fears or suspicions solely based on the race of the person they're interacting with. The third one would be this idea of racial dominance. This is when individuals or societies treat ethnic minorities such as in such a way to rule over them. And this last item would lead us to talk about systemic racism, because when there is a racial dominance in a society, but this makes people question themselves as to why is there such a dominance of one race over the other. And this could be due to several factors. And many people think it would be due to systemic racism. So that would be the belief that due to conscious or unconscious biases, our governments, our institutions, or a legal system, they are producing racial disparities or inequities. So when people are looking at the racial dominance, but they would ask themselves, is this due to unconscious biases, or does it have to do with the fact that, for instance, white people have been in this country for over 400 generations, and they have had plenty of time to establish themselves? So this would be the working definition that we could go by.
Interesting. Now, you said that your family is from Haiti and you've been living in Canada. So, have you yourself experienced racism?
I have, absolutely, I have. Nothing like the generation that came before me, the generation of my parents, when they were told coming in this country that they don't rent apartment to N-words or these type of things. But I've been asked to pay in a restaurant prior to ordering my food. I've been called the N-word and other nasty words. I've been racially profiled by either by the police, or when you walk into a store, people start following you because they think you're gonna steal. So these type of subtle events happen.
Okay, so Ricardo, you mentioned that you feel like you yourself have been racially profiled even by police. So, do you believe that there's
Hmm.
systemic racism in Canada then?
Actually, I do, but I think people are making it a much bigger deal than what it is. And when we're talking about systemic racism, so we just said that this is a system that unconsciously or consciously creates inequities. And I definitely feel like, for instance, in the police, there is such a thing as systemic racism. This is not just a feeling. Actually, it's backed by studies here in Montreal. The city of Montreal had to come clean about the systemic racism inside their police service, and they've admitted that much. So there obviously is, and recent events within the indigenous community has shown here in Quebec that these people are obviously suffering from some type of discrimination. Now, what scares people is the word racism in the systemic racism. There is obviously this a moral connotation, and as Canadians, we don't feel like we're associating this to what happened and still happening in our southern border, in our neighbors, but we feel so different, and we understand the stigma that is attached to this word. So maybe a better term would be systemic discrimination.
Okay, now, Ricardo, you had mentioned being called the N word. So, here in Canada, a University of Ottawa professor was recently suspended for 2 weeks for using the N word in an educational discussion context. So, since then, 34 other professors signed a letter of support defending critical thinking and academic freedom. However, student groups have condemned that letter and have called for a zero tolerance policy regarding the use of the N word. What are your thoughts on that, Ricardo?
Uh, my opinion on this topic isn't these days, I would say that much. But I really don't see why, in an academic context, anyone can use the N word. We obviously can tell when someone is trying to insult somebody or when they're trying to teach us. So I want to refrain from commenting directly the case at the University of Ottawa, because new infos have still been brought to light that have shown that maybe the teacher has not done this for the first time. She might have done this in the past. So until I have all the infos on this, I'll limit my comment to that. But I can say that I have yet to hear a persuasive argument to convince me that this word should be totally banned from our dictionary. I haven't. read the letter that the students have. Was it the student? I think it was the teachers that have drafted the letter I read, and I was not convinced by that. And if I might add, they claim to be speaking on behalf of all Black people, but it is not true. There is not a Black consensus on this issue.
Of course, and that's where it needs to be, right? Interesting. Now, Ricardo, in the US, race has become such a divisive and often violent issue, but here in Canada, we don't see as much violence. Why is that?
So there's a few reasons for this, and I might say I might start by saying that American history is deeply rooted in racism, even to the point that Nazis were inspired by them when they started their pogrom against Jews. So today the debate has been on racism has been polarized by two parties: those who see racism everywhere and those who are in complete denial of it. And this is not a good mix for having a healthy dialogues. And the church has been either completely silent on this issue when it should have been at the forefront of the fight. So as for a long time, this is what has been happening. So when the situation like the recent killing of George Floyd happened, this evidently led to a lot of violence. However, here in Canada, well, we haven't reached that boiling point yet. Well, we shouldn't be complacent and wait until things erupt and get out of hands before we decide to address what's happening in our own backyard. And I would say that the church and our government need to listen to the complaints of ethnic diversities, ethnic minorities, especially those of the indigenous people.
It's interesting that you mentioned the church too, and some say that Christianity is the white man's religion, and that is racist, right? So, what does the Bible have to say about racism?
Uh, But to disclaim of the Christianity being the white man's religion, I would say that the person who would make such a claim is probably ignorant of the history of Christianity and in history in general. Christianity didn't start in Europe; it started in the Middle East among people of color. White people received and converted to Christianity from paganism. They worshiped Thor or Odin or Zeus and these type of other gods. Uh, and most major theological developments happened in Africa. So suffice it to say that it is not a white man's religion. Now, as to the claim of racism, the Bible is clear on its position on racism. The Bible is against racism. The God we serve is a God that says that he's not a God of partiality, and he calls partiality a sin. He's a just God, and he commands us to practice justice. The events in the early church have shown us that God was totally against this idea of ethnic discrimination. It took a lot it took a lot for God to show the apostles that the Gentiles were welcome into the church, and since that point, it was. There was this big idea of racial reconciliation within the church, admitting the pagans into the flock and understanding that we all sons and daughters of God. So the broad message of the Bible has at its core this idea of being one and this idea of reconciliation among races.
So then, what do you think the church needs to improve on when it comes to combating racism and reaching out to all racial groups?
Uh, I would say the church needs to learn how to communicate better with people who are suffering from racial prejudices. Oftentimes, as a Christian, we have been quick to respond, but we're responding when we don't even totally understand the issue or the concerns of the people that are complaining about racial discrimination. So, communication is key. and being caring, being loving, showing people that we are compassionate. Take actions. We have been quiet for too long, and we need to speak out loud, as loud as we are on abortion and other social justice issue. And we need to be biblical about this. There is a biblical foundation that the pastors, the priests, and church leaders, teachers, they have to be responsible about this. They have to show biblically to people why racism is wrong and make sure that this is a part of the teaching that the people are receiving.
What are the pros and cons of the Black Lives Matter movement? Some people have been criticized for saying all lives matter.
That's a very good question. Uh, for the pros, I would say, first of all, BLM, Black Lives Matter, it listens to Black people, and it takes actions, a concrete action on behalf of Black people. And the Black Lives Matter is only highlighting how much the church has failed in some of this area. But the problem is that Black Lives Matters comes from a secular, it's a secular movement, and it wants to address an issue of justice and morality, but they really don't have a foundation to ground their belief in justice and morality. Because without a God, there is no way to talk about an objective system of ethics. So it is a doom to fail. Now, as for the All Lives Matter response, it goes back to what I said a minute ago. We are quick to respond. And this answer only shows how much we don't listen to each other. Does anyone actually believe that Black Lives Matter supporters disagree with the idea that all lives matter? I don't think so. Let's take, for example, if I would say that the life of the unborn matters, no one would respond to me, hey, not only the life of the unborn, but all lives matter. No one would give such a response. But we would immediately understand that I'm just narrowing down my focus on the unborn because I feel like he is the one that is in immediate danger. And this is what people mean when they say Black Lives Matter. And to respond, all lives matter is just to show that we do not understand the claim of the person.
Wow. Well, Ricardo, it looks like we are out of time, but thank you so much on your thoughts on all of these issues. Ricardo Fortune, the Quebec coordinator for Faith Beyond Belief, an apologetics organization based out of Calgary. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Jeanette.
We all have some regrets from our past, some more than others, and sometimes we tend to drag that baggage with us into our present life. Is there a way to forgive and redeem the past and move forward? Today's guest is Kevin Goss, a pastor and church planter in the Spokane, Washington region and author of Dry Bones, Redeeming Your Past, available at befortified.life. He joins me now from Skype. Kevin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Now, Kevin, this book that you have written, it comes out a lot of your own personal experiences. Can you share what's happened in your own life that led you to write about the need for redemption?
Yes, about 25 years after being in ministry, I reached a point of just significant burnout and reaching the end of myself, and there were some lines that were crossed ethically and morally, and just so to speak, a collapse of sorts. And I had to walk through a restoration journey. And out of that journey over the years, God gave my wife and I an opportunity to just share some of the lessons we learned and some of the hope that we received.
What are some of the lessons that you learned in your own journey to healing?
As part of the journey to healing, I learned that, hard work, even for good things, doesn't make up for dealing with some of the things in our lives from our past or some of the challenges in the present. I learned that bitterness and frustration, if not dealt with, can become a deep root in our lives. And I also learned that sometimes our perspectives can be skewed. As one writer said, our feelings are real, they just may not always be right.
Yeah. So, what advice would you give to someone who feels that they've maybe screwed up their past so bad that there's no hope for a better future?
First, even though we can be surprised by the difficulties or the failures we face, that God wasn't surprised by them. It doesn't mean that he approved, but he can still fulfill his purpose and his will in our lives, even though it may look different than, say, our daydreams or the idealistic picture of what we thought it would look like. There is a road ahead. We just have to be ready to adapt that God may creatively do it differently.
Hmm. Now, in your book, you break down three things, like into three different sections: glory days, regrets over missed opportunities, and healing from past pain. So, why these three?
You know, as we walk the journey, God made it clear to us that these are three overarching themes that touch us throughout our lives. Sometimes we look back and wish we could recreate something that we used to have, and it can be frustrating, and that's that glory days. Other times it's the opposite. It's, oh, if I would have made a better decision, where would I be now? And sometimes people question life, relationships, decisions, education, career, and they think they're living a consolation prize life. And then with the past pain, whether it's things I've done or others have done to me, if not dealt with and healed from, we drag them along and they become an accumulated weight as we walk the journey of life.
Hmm. You write that our decisions can either break the bonds of the past or perpetuate past failures into ongoing behavior. What do you mean by that?
Well, you know, when God was talking to the prophet Jeremiah, he told him that he was going to have to sift the precious from the vile. So God places precious things in our life, yet these other factors, if not dealt with, become like a polluting influence. And so my decisions can either reinforce what is polluting my life, or they can move me in a path of obedience, restoring, and new hope in moving forward. So there's this sense that we have to recognize that I'm either going to perpetuate the past or I'm going to learn something new and a new perspective that can take me forward.
Talk to us a bit about the comparison trap. Is it because we tend to compare our lives to those around us?
Very much. We can either be, we look at people we deem as more successful than us and we view ourselves as inferior, or we covet what they have. Or I can look at somebody I think is less successful or who has failed more than I have as a way to justify maybe weaknesses or blind spots in my own life. It's not that we don't learn from others, both their successes and their failures. It's the confusion of setting up value, identity, and purpose on something other than God's plan for our lives. And so the comparison trap, what it does is it takes the eyes off of what God wants to do in my life or each person's life, and it's driving down a road with no rear view or side view mirrors. We have blind spots and we end up having relational and life crashes because we don't have perspective and the proper vision.
Interesting. I like that little, visual there. So when people look back at negative life events, there's sometimes a sense of bitterness, right? So what are some signs of bitterness and how does that affect our lives?
Some key signs is when it starts affecting the way I view the important people in my life. So a bitter person starts looking at loved ones and friends through the lens of suspicion. They have a harder time receiving and giving love, and they tend to become a cynic where someone else's life and behavior hasn't warranted it, meaning I lack trust where someone hasn't been untrustworthy. The other is that I lose the sense to be able to count the blessings for what I do have. Life is measured through, say, the glass being half empty or thinking it all the way empty. And I lose the ability to see that there are daily blessings, even though life also does have daily challenges. And those are two key factors that begin to reveal that bitterness could be rooting in someone's life.
Wow. You say that when our past needs redeeming, we try to fix people around us rather than working on ourselves.
Unfortunately, I heard one speaker say it this way: I love what the Bible says about others. I'm just not crazy about what it says about me. And one of the diverting tactics can sometimes be that if I can fix or control the world around me, I can feel better about myself, but I might be missing the point that there's things that God has to do within me. Sometimes we want to be the teacher when there are moments that God says we need to be the student, and understanding the place we are in our life and accepting that there's things we need to learn and to grow in is key to having our past redeemed.
Wow. And these are all things that you personally have experienced coming through all of this?
Yes, I spent a quarter of a century being primarily in the positions of leadership, people coming to me, expecting me to have the answers. And I went through a journey over years where God then placed me in positions of submission, of subordinate roles, where there was much for me to learn, almost like a shift in the middle of my life. And I began to see that many of the things that frustrated me had more to do with God needing to clear my perspective, deal with some things in my past, and give me fresh opportunities to move forward. So yes, all of these I had to walk through personally.
Yeah. Now, do people going through problems like this, are they able to have they sought you out personally, almost as a counselor?
There have been times, some through our writings, other times through speaking, and there have been other times through individual counseling that myself, along with my wife, have been able to work with individuals and couples for them to experience really God's best in their lives. We see ourselves as facilitators. We know this is a work that God needs to do in someone's life, but there are times skilled helpers make a significant difference. We know that was true in our lives, and we just want to be available to do our part, whatever God has for someone else.
That's wonderful. So getting back to that wounded feeling, when someone has seriously wounded us, it can be so hard to truly forgive, right? Can you give us an idea of how to work through the forgiveness process and what's involved?
I admit that it's a journey, but it does come with a few key principles. One, even if someone's hurt me horribly, I have to make a decision. Is Jesus Christ and what he did on the cross, is that ultimately greater than even the sins committed against me? It's easier for me to think of God forgiving me, but sometimes I'm concerned that he might forgive someone else because I feel like they might get away with it. So sometimes we hold on to things that are like, oh no, God might forgive them, kind of like Jonah, where he was concerned that God would forgive the Ninevites. And so a principle is that Jesus is even greater than their sin against me. A second is forgiveness doesn't make them right, but it does make me free. There was a wonderful pastor who his words taught me significant in that area. And third, forgiveness doesn't always mean the same relationship boundaries. They may change for the sake of safety and trust, but forgiveness is a way of the individual being free from that other person's sin against them.
That's a great nugget of wisdom there. So how do you know when you've truly forgiven somebody?
Well, I'd love to say that it's a magic moment. I would say that there's a few factors. One, when I find that negative thoughts and feelings about that person come up, that I'm more ready to bring them to the Lord and say, okay, God, I give them to you again today. Second, God begins to give an individual the ability to pray for other people that before they never thought they could pray for. And third, people are able to either move on in relationship without that person, if need be, because of healthy boundaries. And if there is the ability to reconnect where it's healthy and it's safe, they find that the road begins to restore relationship. That's case by case, depending on what has happened. But we find that some of those are the factors that we see that begin to reveal a forgiving spirit growing within us.
Interesting. You talk about the games people play in your book, especially when they're trying to justify wrong behavior. What are some of these games?
They can be very subtle, although they're noticed more than people think. People can do it with their looks, like maybe they're trying to gain more attention from other people. It can be in their body language, their words. What ends up happening is through the relationships of life, people try to get emotional and relational needs met from people for whom it's not intended. So, for instance, if someone's in a position of trust or leadership like I'm in, there are certain people that I'm to serve. It's not their responsibility to meet needs within me. Part of getting away from those games is recognizing that we have to want more for people than from them, and that no relationship and no person is really ever meant to be used as a manipulation to meet an underlying need that either needs to come from God or the right person he's put in our lives.
You are full of wisdom, Kevin. Any final advice for viewers struggling with redeeming their past?
I would just want them to know that at the moment, even if they have a hard time seeing the way forward, that God does have a plan for their life. It's not a self-help statement. It's a recognition that this moment is not their destiny. And I would encourage them to take intentional steps with God and maybe skilled, trusted others so that they can see that there is a light at the end of that tunnel. It may take time, but it can happen for them.
Ah, what a positive message. And with that, it looks like we are about out of time. Thank you so much, Kevin, for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It's been a privilege.
That was Kevin Goss, the author of Dry Bones, Redeeming Your Past, available at befortified.life. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at VCN. Thanks for watching.